the mountains of Appalachia, where the fog lingers heavy and the roads fade into dirt, there was a family unlike any other. Their cabins stood deep in the hollows, away from the eyes of townsfolk, tucked behind walls of pine and stone. Outsiders rarely saw them, and those who did often wished they hadn't, for in their faces there was something unsettling, too pale for the sun, too silent for children, and too similar to one another, as if time itself had stopped their blood from ever changing. Locals whispered that no stranger ever joined their line, that husbands were brothers and wives were sisters, and children were born into a circle too tight to escape. When a name appeared in the county's records, it was often the same one repeated, stretching back for generations. Ministers refused to visit, teachers gave up on teaching, and doctors pretended they had never heard the name at all. What made them feared was not just the silence, but the sameness. Stories told of children with eyes too wide, of voices that never rose above a whisper, of family gatherings where no one laughed, only stared. A people who seemed more like shadows of one another than individuals of flesh and blood. In the stillness of those mountains, the clan endured, bound not by choice but by a secret too old, too dark to be spoken aloud. By the late 1800s, whispers of the family began to seep into nearby towns. Census takers sent by the county would climb the ridge, only to return pale and trembling, their records half empty, their handwriting shaky. When asked why so many blanks filled their ledgers, they would shake their heads and mutter, "It ain't fit to be written." Some never returned at all. The hollows swallowed them whole, as if the land itself was protecting its secret. Old church sermons hinted at sins that twisted the blood. Pastors would stand at their pulpits, warning the congregation of unnatural unions that mock the law of God. But when pressed, none dared name the family aloud. They would only gesture toward the mountains, where the fog sat heavy and the trees stood still. It wasn't just preachers and census takers who noticed. Teachers, too, whispered of children whose names and ages did not make sense. One girl of 9 introduced as her own sister's daughter, a boy listed as both a son and a brother, depending on which Bible you opened. The names repeated in circles, looping endlessly, as if the family tree had no branches, only a trunk curling back on itself. Neighbors claimed they heard things at night, the creak of floorboards carrying the weight of too many footsteps, hushed, voices rising and falling, but never laughing. The faint cry of a newborn echoing across the valley when no one had been pregnant in sight. Lanterns burned late into the night, casting shadows across nailed-shut windows. The air smelled of wood smoke and something sour, something heavy, that carried downwind to the nearest farms. When strangers, hunters, trappers, or unlucky travelers, strayed too close to the property, they returned shaken. One told of seeing 3 young women standing in a row on a sagging porch, each one heavily pregnant, their faces nearly identical. Their skin was waxy, pale as if drained of blood, and their wide eyes reflected lantern light like glass. They did not speak. They did not smile. They only stared, unblinking, until the man turned and fled down the mountain. The sheriff, when told of such things, offered no comfort. "Best you leave it," he'd say, voice low. "Best you mind your own." For in those mountains, secrets weren't hidden by chance, they were guarded. The law itself seemed to bow before the silence of that family. In courthouse basements, drawers of records were locked away, birth certificates marked invalid, marriage licenses never filed. When a courthouse fire burned through half the documents in 1912, locals swore someone had chosen carefully which records to save and which to let the flames consume. Pages turned to ash, but the memory lived on in whispers. People remembered children born with eyes that would not close, babies too frail to survive their first winter, Men and women whose faces blurred together in memory because they all looked too much the same. Doctors refused to climb the ridge, but rumors drifted down. Children born with twisted bones, adults whose bodies bent under the weight of malformations, voices that never rose beyond a murmur. The county physician once wrote a single line in his private journal after visiting the family. "The blood is too close." He never returned. Weeks later, he moved counties altogether, and his replacement refused to acknowledge the hollow at all. But perhaps most chilling were the stories told by those who stumbled upon the family graveyard. Hidden deep in the woods, it was nothing more than a patch of land with crude markers, unmarked stones, wooden crosses weathered to splinters, and small depressions in the earth where children had been laid. No names carved, no dates remembered. Just silence. Dozens of graves forgotten by the world, remembered only by the soil that swallowed them. For the townsfolk at the edge of the mountains, the family became more legend than neighbor. A warning passed down in hushed tones. Don't go near their land. Don't look too long into their windows. Don't ask questions about their children. To do so was to invite something into your life you could never unsee. And so the hollow remained sealed by silence. The family grew in shadows, their faces repeating generation after generation, their names fading into the void where records should have been. Outsiders called them cursed. Locals simply called them the people of the hollow. And still, the bloodline coiled tighter, binding itself to itself, deeper with every birth. The mountains remember, even when the people do not. And in those ridges, the truth sat waiting, dark, patient, and more disturbing than anyone dared put to paper. By the 1930s, the family in the hollow had lived in silence for so long that they had become less like neighbors and more like phantoms. Outsiders who caught even the faintest glimpse of them spoke of a sameness that was impossible to ignore. Not just family resemblance, the kind you might expect between cousins or siblings, but something deeper, stranger. Teachers who tried to enroll their children in school reported faces that repeated like echoes. Round cheeks, hollowed eyes, pale skin stretched too thin. A dozen children could have been mistaken for one. Some sat in classrooms with their heads bowed, their lips never parting, their voices never rising. When called upon, they whispered so faintly that teachers leaned in close, only to recoil at the sight of those wide, unblinking eyes staring straight through them. Locals claimed the children did not play in the fields like others their age. No laughter rang out from their cabins. No skipping footsteps crossed the dirt roads. Instead, the children moved in small groups, silent, trailing behind one another like shadows. Their hair was thin, sometimes patchy, as if it never grew quite right. Some bore crooked teeth, too many for their small mouths, while others had jaws so narrow their lips never fully closed. But it wasn't just their appearances that unsettled outsiders. It was their stillness, their silence. A teacher once wrote in her private journal that it felt as though the children were waiting for someone to tell them who they were, as if they had no identity of their own. Another recalled a boy who drew the same figure over and over, a circle within a circle, never ending, always closing in on itself. When asked what it meant, the boy looked up and whispered, "It's us." By then, rumors had spread beyond the valley. Preachers traveling from neighboring counties warned their flocks of unnatural bloodlines. Midwives whispered of infants born with too many fingers, of babies whose eyes never opened, of mothers too young to have carried such burdens. Some said the family did not even weep at funerals. Graves were dug quickly, shallow holes in the earth, covered in stones rather than marked with names. Hunters told stories of glimpsing the family in the woods, pale faces glimmering between the trees, motionless, watching. One described stumbling into a clearing where 5 figures stood in a line, their faces nearly identical, their mouths slightly open but silent. He swore that when he blinked, they were gone. He never set foot near the ridge again. Even there, cabins bore the mark of secrecy. Curtains nailed shut, windows covered in tar paper, doors that opened rarely, and only when the family needed to slip into the night unseen. Lanterns glowed inside, but the light was dim, as if even fire had been taught to whisper. The county physician's quiet warning that the blood is too close seemed to take on new meaning. For generation after generation, the faces repeated, blurred, becoming less individual and more like a single mask passed down. Neighbors said that if you spoke to one of them, you felt you were speaking to them all, as though their voices belonged to the same throat. Some claimed it was a kind of curse. Others said it was punishment for breaking the laws of kinship. But the truth was simpler and more haunting. In the hollow, the circle had closed too tightly. There were no new names, no new faces, no new blood. Only repetition, only silence. The children of the hollow grew into parents, and the cycle began again. A closed loop of blood and bone, folding back on itself with every generation. And while the rest of the county moved on, building schools, paving roads, expanding farms, the hollow remained frozen in place, its people trapped in a lineage that refused to change. It was a place where time stopped, where bloodlines turned inward, where children's faces mirrored their parents so perfectly that outsiders swore they were staring into a reflection. A family whose greatest secret was written not in books or ledgers, but in the faces they carried. Faces that all looked the same. In 1947, a county physician was dispatched into the hollow after rumors spread of sickness that seemed to linger generation after generation. Neighbors spoke of children who never grew, of infants who never cried, of mothers who disappeared after childbirth. Most doctors avoided the hollow, claiming they had no time to waste on hill rumors. But this physician, young, idealistic, still clinging to the belief that medicine could cure all things, made the journey up the ridge. What he found haunted him for the rest of his life. The cabins were falling in on themselves, leaning sideways, as though the land itself wanted to swallow them. Inside, the air reeked of damp wood, smoke, and sickness. Children sat on the floor, their limbs thin as twigs, their faces pale and expressionless. Some never looked up, their heads drooping as though too heavy for their necks. Others stared straight ahead, their eyes wide, ringed with shadow, unblinking. The physician noted deformities he had never seen outside of textbooks, spines curved into impossible angles, jaws that jutted unnaturally forward, ears too small to hear, mouths too large for speech. Infants swaddled in rags lay silent, their chests rising with shallow breaths. He touched one child's forehead and recoiled at the unnatural heat. Yet, the boy did not cry, not even a whimper. He asked about the fathers. The mothers said nothing. He asked about the births. The older women turned their faces away. When he pressed further, the silence grew so heavy it felt like a wall pressing against him. Finally, one man spoke, a gaunt figure with hollow cheeks, and a voice so flat it seemed drained of life. "It is what it is. The blood is too close." That night, the physician sat at the edge of his cot in a borrowed cabin, writing in his ledger. He detailed every malformation, every sickness, every whisper of silence that hung over the family. But when he reached the end, he hesitated. After a long pause, he wrote only one final line. "The blood is too close." He shut the book and never opened it again. When he returned to the county, he filed a vague report: malnutrition, poor hygiene, possible hereditary conditions. The details, what he had really seen, he kept locked away in his private journal. Within weeks, he resigned. his post and moved counties. His replacement, older and less curious, refused to visit the hollow at all. "Let them be," he reportedly told the board. "Some things are better left unseen." But word spread. Teachers spoke of the physician's visit in hushed tones. Farmers who traded near the ridge swore that he had left pale and shaking, a haunted look in his eyes. And though the official record reduced his visit to a few sterile words, the people of the valley understood the truth. Whatever sickness plagued that family was not something a doctor could cure. It was something born of the blood itself, generation after generation, folding in on itself until the body could no longer bear the weight, and so the hollow grew quieter. The curtains stayed drawn. The children grew into parents, their deformities carried forward. And the land itself seemed to groan under the weight of the secret. The physician's words still echo. The blood is too close. A warning, a diagnosis, and a curse, all in one. By the 1970s, the hollow was nearly empty. The cabins had sagged into the earth, their roofs collapsed, their porches swallowed by vines. Where once dozens of children had lived in suffocating silence, only a handful of figures remained. A man, in his 60s, gaunt and watchful, and 3 girls who rarely stepped beyond the shadow of the cabin. A social worker, responding to neighbors' reports of screams in the night, climbed the ridge. What she saw was recorded in a cold, clinical tone: severe neglect, possible incest. But her notes revealed something deeper between the lines. She described the girls, thin, pale, their hair cut unevenly, their eyes wide and vacant. 2 were already pregnant, their bellies swelling against worn dresses. They did not speak. They did not look away from her gaze. They only stared, as though waiting for something they knew must come. Within weeks, the cabin was gone. Fire consumed it in the night, flames rising above the tree line like a beacon no one dared approach. Some said the blaze was an accident, sparked by the family's lanterns. Others whispered it was deliberate, a final attempt to bury what the county could never admit. When the embers cooled, no bodies were found. The man, the girls, their unborn children, all vanished into smoke and ash. But the silence that followed was louder than fire. Neighbors swore they saw figures fleeing into the woods that night, thin silhouettes with long hair, moving quick as shadows. Others claimed they heard voices in the dark, calling names that no one had ever written down. The sheriff closed the case, recording only cause undetermined, residents presumed deceased. Yet the land remembers. Today, the hollow lies quiet. The graves are unmarked, the records erased, the cabins lost to rot. And still, the story breathes. Some hikers claim to see pale faces at the edge of the trees, watching with unblinking eyes. Others hear whispers in the wind, low, broken words calling for fathers, for brothers, for husbands. Always the same names, repeated like a prayer too cursed to be spoken aloud. The darkest secret of Appalachia was never buried. It lingers in the soil, in the silence, in the bloodlines that refuse to end. And for those who dare listen, the echoes remain.